We're going to start recording and going to screen sharing as usual, and keep in mind that today we're going to talk about some of the other terrestrial biomes. Keep in mind what we said, that the biomes are divided up differently by different sources. So if you're not really using our book, if you're looking at information just online or in another textbook, it's quite possible that they might divide the biomes up a little bit differently. There are some people, you could call them the lumpers, who just say that there are 4 biomes. There's the desert, there's grasslands, there's forests, and there's the tundra. And then they subdivide those into, several different types of forests, several different types of grasslands. So we're looking at different types of forests and calling them different biomes. But depending on what you look at, you might find more divisions than our book uses and that we're talking about in class. You might find fewer. So don't let that upset you either way. So today we're going to look at some of the biomes kind of in between. All the biomes that we looked at the other day were rather extreme, in the sense that in the desert and tundra, we're talking about extremely dry environments. In the rainforest, we're talking about an extremely wet environment. With most deserts, because they're dry, they're also extremely hot or extremely cold. We don't find deserts that have kind of average spring-like weather throughout the year. So today we're going to focus on some of the biomes kind of in between. If you think about the tundra, that's located inside the Arctic Circle, essentially. The tropical rainforest, obviously, is located in the tropics near the equator. And the deserts are kind of scattered here and there. So what we're going to be doing is looking at some of the biomes between the tropics, where we find the rainforest, and the tundra. So the first one we're going to think about is temperate grasslands. And these are sometimes called prairies or steppes, or they have lots of different names in different areas. The Pampas in Argentina are an example of a grassland. And if we look at grasslands, typically they receive about 20 to 35 inches of precipitation a year. Now, remember, one of the things we said earlier is that Chicago usually gets about 33 inches of precipitation a year. So it looks like historically, Chicago would probably be a grassland, except if we go back historically, at least to when the Europeans arrived, since we don't have really good records before then. There were a number of Native American tribes living in the Chicago area. And they often burned the prairies that they found. And burning helps to maintain grasslands, because if we look at the apical meristem of the stem, now remember, the apical meristem of the stem makes the stem grow longer. In grasses, that apical meristem is underneath the soil. It's underneath the surface of the ground. So unless a fire gets very hot, when a fire sweeps through a grassland, the apical meristem of the grasses are underground, they survive, and that means grasses can begin growing again very quickly. In most dicots, most woody plants, which is what we would find in a forest, the apical meristem is above the ground. And in a forest fire or a prairie fire, the apical meristems of those dicots are killed, because they're above ground, they're exposed to the fire. And since the apical meristems are killed, this means that it takes a much longer period of time for bushes and trees to come in and reestablish themselves. So we know that the Indians helped the grassland stay established in Chicago. But since the Europeans have gotten here, the Europeans haven't set fires as frequently as the Native Americans did. So as a result, Chicago has become more heavily forested. Now we're right on the borderline. We had some forest anyway, but we probably have more in recent years due to the lack of regular fires. People generally consider fires to be a bad thing, but in many environments, think about if you've seen on the news about all the fires in Australia or the fires that seem to spiral out of control every 2 or 3 years in the Western United States. If we don't let dead plant material burn on a regular basis, then when a fire does start, it's usually much more devastating. Now, notice that forests typically require more precipitation. Why? Because trees need more water than grasses do. So when we look at an area that's a grassland, and if we look at this picture off to the left, it looks like we can see some trees and maybe 1 or 2 scattered out here on the horizon, even in the center. In grasslands, what we find is, just like any other type of biome, the ground isn't perfectly level. And where the ground is a little bit lower, water tends to accumulate. You probably heard the saying, water runs downhill or water seeks its own level. In these lower spots where there's a little more moisture, where the moisture lasts a little bit longer before it evaporates, this is where we find trees. So in a lot of grasslands, one of the main places we find trees is along stream beds and river beds, because the stream or river cuts into the ground, it erodes it, so the ground there is a little bit lower, which means we've got that water in the stream, and so right next to the stream or river, there's a little more water available. Now, anytime we talk about a temperate biome, keep in mind Chicago is in the temperate region of the world. Temperate areas have 4 distinct seasons. And temperate biomes tend to have very cold, dry winters. And we've talked about the dryness before. This is mainly due to the fact that any water that does fall is in the form of either snow or ice, and snow and ice can't be absorbed by plant roots. And they also have hot, dry summers. Well, if it's dry in the summer and dry in the winter, when do we get precipitation? Most of the precipitation is during the fall or the spring. That's when most of the moisture falls. So that's when it's available. Remember, we talked about for plants that have wood, they produce more xylem, more wood during the spring to carry water. So fires are important in maintaining grasslands. Now, what happens if you don't have Native Americans around to set the fires? Well, lightning strikes caused by heavy thunderstorms can begin fires. And they happen often enough. The disturbances are so regular in prairies around the world, in savannas and grasslands, that the dicot plants are killed on a regular basis and the monocot plants survive. So these are very regular disturbances. And again, going back to something we talked about earlier, this is why some ecologists don't like to talk about succession, because if you have fires so often that a grassland that could become a forest never actually becomes a forest, then is succession just a theoretical concept that doesn't really occur in the real world? Grasslands are where we find the large herds of grazing animals around the world. In North America, before the Europeans got here, this is where the bison, what we commonly call buffalo, are found. If you go to Africa in some of the savannas, which is a particular type of grassland, this is where we find the herds of zebra and wildebeest and animals like that. Now, one of the things that we've seen as populations have expanded and as our technology for killing animals has been better, a lot of these populations of grazing animals have been decimated. This is a famous photo from the American West. And if we look at this photo, one of the things we can see is a guy standing on top of a hill. And if you look carefully at what's in front of this guy's legs from about the knees on down, this is actually a bison skull. This picture was taken in the American West, and this mound, which is about 30 feet high, is bison skulls. And there are actually several million bison skulls in this picture. So if you think about this, if you read stories about the American West, there are descriptions of herds of bison stretching from horizon to horizon, as far as the eye could see. Well, this is why the herds don't stretch from horizon to horizon anymore. One of the things that civilized people have often done throughout history is they've hunted for sport. They've killed animals just for the thrill of the hunt. And in some cases, in a bird population that was found in North America called passenger pigeons were actually driven into extinction. They were all killed. And people did eat pigeon meat, but a lot of them were killed just for sport, for the fun of shooting things. Notice when we look at the temperate grasslands, they generally have the richest soil of all the biomes. Here are some diagrams of soils in some of the biomes. And this kind of dark brownish reddish layer is the area where we find humus, decaying organic material, where we find the part of the soil that's actually good for plant growth. Notice how thick this layer is in the grassland. This is because when we look at grasslands, they're in a temperate environment. So the temperature is warm part of the year, cold part of the year. Well, remember when we talked about the tundra, bacteria don't do so good in the cold. So organic material is partly decomposed, but also a lot of organic material accumulates in the soil. And we don't have a lot of moisture. So again, things like fungi and bacteria, the typical decomposers, do better in moist environments. So decomposition is faster than it is in an area like the desert or the tundra, but it's slower than it is in other environments. If we look at the soils in some of the other environments, we see that in the temperate deciduous forest, which we haven't talked about yet, we'll get to in a minute, here on the top left, notice that the soil isn't as dark as it is here, but there are some dark colors up near the top here. And the temperate deciduous forest, kind of for the same reasons we just talked about with the grassland, has very fertile soil. Now, if we look at the coniferous forest or the boreal forest or the taiga, which we also haven't talked about yet, we'll get to in a few moments, this has a relatively thin layer of soil, but one of the reasons that the soil is not very rich is because pine needles are very strongly acidic. And if you have a coniferous tree in your front yard, or if you have one in your neighborhood, if you look directly underneath that conifer, there's kind of a circle where the needles fall off the tree and land. And there's not much else that grows in that circle right underneath the conifer. That's because the soil is so strongly acidic that there aren't very many other plants that can tolerate that acid soil. And that also slows decomposition down a little bit. So similar to the tundra, where remember we said we have a lot of undecomposed organic material in that permafrost, there is a lot of undecomposed organic material, but there's not a lot of humus, the decomposed organic material in the soil. In the tropical rainforest, there's a very thin layer up here at the top, kind of a dark red right underneath the green plant. Remember what we said, the tropical rainforest actually has very poor soil because the nutrients get absorbed so quickly. They're mostly tied up in the plants. They're not actually in the soil. And if we look at desert soil actually has a fair amount of organic materials, but we don't see a lot of plant growth in the desert for other reasons, namely lack of water. So because of the fact that temperate grasslands have the richest soils, if you go around the world as human populations have expanded, grasslands have been taken over and used for farming because this is where the best soil is. Now, one of the problems we have is, particularly with modern industrial methods of farming, there's a lot of soil erosion. A lot of this topsoil gets worn off the land. And over many years, the land actually becomes less and less fertile. You know, if you ever read about Abraham Lincoln's family when he was a child, his family started out with a farm in eastern Indiana. And then later they moved to Kentucky. And then later they moved a little bit further west into Illinois. Why did they keep moving? Because as they kept farming the land, it became less and less fertile. So, and this was a very common pattern in the early colonization of the United States. Many families started out actually east of the Appalachians, moved across the Appalachians, and then may have moved one or two more times. And the same pattern continued in the West. People might start a farm in Iowa, later move to Nebraska, and eventually end up in California. Now, the other type of biome that's found in Illinois, besides the temperate grassland, and if you think about Illinois, the temperate grassland is mostly to the west of the Chicago region. And it extends down to about central Illinois. But if you get to southern Illinois, or up in this region, if you get more in eastern Illinois, we mostly have the temperate deciduous forest. So again, this is found in a temperate region. So we're in an area where we have distinct seasons, where a lot of the precipitation occurs during the spring and fall, rather than in the middle of summer or the middle of winter. Notice there's more precipitation, 30 to 60 inches, than we see in the grassland. The grassland is typically between about 15 and 25 inches or 35 inches. So notice there is a little bit of overlap. We have an area that's receiving 30 inches of rain. Do we get a temperate grassland or a temperate deciduous forest? Well, it partly depends on other factors. What type of soil we have. Does the moisture drain out of this soil very quickly? Or does it stay in the soil for a while? But with enough moisture, now this type of biome can support the growth of trees. Trees typically need more moisture than grasses do. Now, one of the things we see is deciduous refers to things that fall out. And actually, if you were a dentist, you would have heard this term before, because the teeth that we call baby teeth, in dentistry, their technical name is they are deciduous teeth, because they fall out. So deciduous trees lose their leaves, typically on a yearly basis. And usually, like around here, we say that this happens because of the cold weather. And in a sense, that's true. But in a way, it's more accurate to think of this as happening because when the temperatures drop, the water freezes and plant roots can't absorb ice and snow. So since the plant roots can't absorb ice and snow, you can't keep leaves because leaves have those stomata, those holes that open to let in carbon dioxide. But when they open and let in CO2, the plant loses water. So one way to avoid this issue in winter when the roots can't absorb water is lose your leaves. And then that really minimizes the water loss. Now, when we look at the actual chemistry of photosynthesis, what we see is that the solar energy, when it strikes the plant cells and when it stimulates chlorophyll, remember that chlorophyll basically transforms this solar energy into chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. But this energy from the sun is so intense, it gradually destroys the chlorophyll. So what we see when we look at plants is that they constantly have to rebuild their chlorophyll over the growing season. Now, in fall, when the light intensity starts decreasing and the chlorophyll in the plant cells starts to degrade, the plants just don't rebuild that chlorophyll anymore. They let the last little bit of chlorophyll deteriorate and they don't make any more. And this seems to be something that's triggered by shortening day length, not by temperature. So that as the days get shorter in the fall, plants are less likely to rebuild their chlorophyll. Well, when they don't rebuild their chlorophyll, this is when we talk about the leaves changing color in the fall. Now, notice that these colors are due to three main types of chemicals. Some chemicals called xanthophylls and carotenes and anthocyanins. And xanthophylls are the main chemicals that give leaves a kind of a yellowish color. Carotenes, think of carrots, give leaves a kind of a yellowish color. Now, the xanthophylls and the carotenes are actually in the leaves all year. It's just that in most plant leaves, there are so many molecules of chlorophyll that we don't see the yellows and the oranges that are there. The anthocyanins are a little bit different. The anthocyanins are actually synthesized in the fall. So they're not actually made. So we get these different colors due to different chemicals in the leaves. So if you think about some leaves that are kind of reddish or orangish or yellowish all year round, that means that those plants have less chlorophyll in them and they have more of one of those other chemicals. Now, almost all leaves, after they turn colors, if we wait a little bit longer, those colors start to fade. Again, these pigments get degraded when they interact with sunlight. That energy is so intense. And in the fall, these pigments are only made for a short period of time. That's why if you're trying to go to Wisconsin or New England or someplace that's famous for its fall colors, that's why you have to time it right, because those fall colors are not around very long. But after these colors fade, almost all tree leaves turn kind of a brownish color. And the brownish color is caused by certain chemicals called tannins. And the tannins are found in other parts of the plant. They're there all year round. Some of them are made in larger amounts in the fall, but again, we don't usually see these browns throughout most of the year because of the fact that they're overshadowed by the amount of chlorophyll. Now, when we're looking at a deciduous forest, the trees lose their leaves for part of the year. So notice this is very different than what we talked about in the tropical rainforest, where we said trees lose a few leaves at a time here and there. So there are never really bare patches on the bottom of a tropical rainforest. In the deciduous forest, there are bare patches in the spring before the leaves come out. There are bare patches in the fall after trees start losing their leaves. And there may be bare patches off and on throughout the summer. So because of this, there's a lot more sunlight that reaches the forest floor in a temperate deciduous forest than there is in the tropical rainforest. And because more sunlight reaches the forest floor, there's a much thicker growth of small plants. So here we see something like you would see if you went out and took a walk through the forest, in Illinois. And notice this picture was actually taken in the middle of summer. Even then, there's enough sunlight reaching the forest floor that there's a pretty thick growth of plants. So as opposed to if this was the tropical rainforest, this would be almost bare. We'd have a few small plants down here, but not very many because not that much rainfall or sunlight gets through to the forest floor. Okay, finally, let's look at one more type of biome, the boreal forests. And the boreal forests are also known as the taiga. Keep in mind that taiga is the Russian word for pine trees, essentially. They're also called coniferous forests. That's a little bit deceptive, even though most of the trees are conifers, just because if we go to the tropics and the tropical rainforest, a lot of those trees are actually conifers. If we would look at a map of the Earth and we would focus on the Northern Hemisphere, the boreal forests or the taiga form a strip that pretty much goes around the world. It stretches across Europe, Russia, into Asia, and across North America. There are a few spots in Asia where it disappears because some of the parts of Asia are so far inland, they don't get enough rain, so they're actually desert rather than boreal forest. So when we look at these forests, they're basically, you could think of them as being between the tundra and either the temperate grasslands or the temperate deciduous forests. There are some boreal forests in the very southern part of South America, but notice there is no tundra in South America because the continent doesn't actually extend far enough south. Notice that boreal forests don't get as much rain as the other forests we've been talking about. We just talked about the temperate deciduous forest, typically 30 to 66 inches of rain. When we talked about the tropical rainforest, at least 66 inches of rain. Notice if we look at the boreal forests, they only get about as much rain as grasslands do in many environments. So how are trees able to survive? Because remember, we said grasses don't need as much rain as trees do. Well, the way that we're able to have trees survive here is because of the fact that when we look at the boreal forests, so if you're thinking about where we are, you're going into Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, southern Canada. Temperatures are lower there. Since temperatures are lower, there's much less evapotranspiration of water from the plant leaves. So even though they get less rainfall, less precipitation, because there's less loss of water, trees can survive in this environment. So if we look at the trees, they have numerous adaptations for having a long, cold winter season. When we think of pine trees, the one thing a lot of us think of is their typical cone shape, like you see on, drawings of Christmas trees. And this might seem somewhat arbitrary. Notice we don't see this on deciduous trees, but deciduous trees lose their leaves in winter. Coniferous trees keep their needles, their leaves. And because of this shape, this helps them to shed snow so that the snow doesn't accumulate to the point where it breaks branches or accumulate to the point where there's so much weight that it kills the entire tree. If we look at the leaves, since they're needle shaped, goes back to one of the things we talked about earlier in the semester. Think about the total surface area on the needle of a pine tree compared to the surface area of a big flat leaf on an oak tree. A lot less surface area. What does that help with? Less water is lost because remember, surface area, that's where the sun hits. And so the more surface area, the more water is lost. If we look at the needles on conifers, they tend to be a darker green color than the leaves that we see on deciduous trees. And a dark color absorbs more solar energy. So if you're in an environment where it's typically a little bit colder, where the summer growing season isn't as long, you want to absorb as much solar energy as possible. And because almost all conifers are evergreen, meaning they don't lose all their leaves at once, that means when conditions improve, either in the spring or if there's a warm spell in the winter, conifers can start photosynthesizing immediately. They don't have to do what deciduous trees do, which is waste a lot of time building new leaves before you can start photosynthesizing. So all of these factors combined help conifers survive in their environment. Now, remember, we talked about the fact that many species of birds migrate to the tundra in the summer because there's such an immense population of insects. And what we find is all over the world, migratory birds tend to stop in the boreal forest. They don't stay there long. In North America, about 50% of all migratory species stop in the boreal forest. In North America, we find animals like elk, beaver, moose, and wolverines in this area. Some of these animals, like beavers especially, are found further south, but most of the other animals are unique to this area. Because of the plants and animals that are found there, in North America, this biome is sometimes referred to as the moose, goose, blue spruce biome. One of the dominant trees is the blue spruce. Moose are one of the dominant large herbivores. Geese mostly migrate through this biome, although some of them do settle on the ponds and lakes in this biome permanently. One of the wonderful things we have here in North America, if you ever get a chance to see it, is out in Western Canada, there is a national park called Banff National Park. And if you ever get a chance, it's a wonderful place to go. Depending on what part of the park you visit, there are grasslands, but there's also some of the boreal forest. You can see wild herds of bison and all sorts of other animals. It's really a cool place. So I would recommend that you visit that if you ever get the chance. Are there any questions about these biomes before we leave them? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a moment and start sharing another screen. I'm going to put up the screen for the assignment, so you should see a little chart here. This is in Word, so you should just be able to type into this, but if you can't, you can make another table, or you can list all these items. So I mentioned we were going to have an assignment on biomes. So this is the assignment. This is due next Tuesday. I think I have the date corrected now. It was pointed out to me that I put April 2nd or April 4th for the due date instead of May 4th. So what you're going to do for each of these three biomes, and notice these are three that we haven't talked about. The savanna, the temperate rainforest. So this is a rainforest found in temperate regions. We talked about this a little bit. We talked about Washington, Oregon, the west coast of some of the California mountain ranges, and the tropical deciduous forest. Now remember what I've said, there are different ways to classify biomes. So these are three biomes that we didn't discuss, but some books would discuss. So what I'm going to have you do is kind of fill in the blanks. So location, where in the world are these found? So you can look this up on a map. Some places will tell you. Temperature. So what are the temperatures like in these areas? Do they have, and don't just say warm, cold. Think about when we've discussed our environments. Do they have hot summers and cold winters? Is it just warm all year round? Precipitation. How much precipitation do they get? Is it spread out fairly evenly throughout the year, or is it concentrated in one or two seasons? What about the soil? Is the soil good? Is it poor? Are there a lot of nutrients in it? Does it retain water? Does water go through it very quickly? Does decomposition happen fast? What type of plants are found in this environment? Or not just trees, but grasses, smaller plants. So think of this more in general terms. You can list a genus or two if you want, but think of the types of plants. So what are their characteristics? Keep in mind, if you list a genus, make sure that you italicize the genus name, species name too, if you include that. And plants is on here twice. Don't know why that is. I would say just fill out one of those for plants, and you can probably just delete that whole row, and then this will fit on one page. The same thing for animals as for plants. What types of animals are found in these areas? Give some examples. When we talked about animals, you know, do they live in any unusual circumstances? Do they live in burrows? Do they migrate out of the region during the bad seasons? You know, what can you say about the animals? And then other, which is miscellaneous. You know, in some of the areas we've talked about things like in the rainforest, they contain lots and lots of species. So, you know, so fill these out. These can be relatively brief. I think I've set it up so that when you type into each cell, if you type in more than will fit, the cell will just expand, and your chart may move down onto the second page. You know, tell me one or two things about each characteristic for each biome. And then this is due next Tuesday night. Are there any questions about this assignment? Okay, if not, then I will let you go and I will see you on Monday. So enjoy the weekend. And next week, we're still going to talk a little bit about aquatic biomes and the biosphere, kind of the largest level of studying the environment. And then we'll get our last question set later in the week that will be due the week after.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.